Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're embarking on a journey, really getting into the personal account of the Dalai Lama. We'll be looking at his reflections on Tibet's history, the invasion by communist China, his life in exile, and, well, the ongoing struggle.
And our main source here is his own book, right?
Mhm.
Giving us that firsthand perspective on, decades of leadership, both political and spiritual.
Exactly. Our mission today is to try and grasp the key events, the huge challenges, and the philosophy, the guiding principles he's used through all this complexity.
And you've mentioned wanting to get knowledge quickly but thoroughly.
Mm.
Well, today we're cutting through a lot of history, a lot of geopolitics, to bring you the essentials from a truly unique life.
Expect some perhaps surprising details and moments that really make you think.
Definitely.
Okay, let's dive right in. So the Dalai Lama emphasizes this point. His role wasn't something he sought out.
No, not at all.
It was thrust upon him, recognized at, age 2?
Incredible, isn't it?
Yeah.
Just 2 years old.
And then, formalized in 1950, he becomes Tibet's temporal leader at just 16.
16. Think about that. The weight of a nation on shoulders that young.
Mm.
From that moment, he saw his core duty as protecting Tibet, its people, its culture.
Yeah, the sheer weight of it. Leading spiritually and politically at 16, especially with all the shifts happening across Asia then, it really highlights how unique Tibetan society was and its traditions.
Absolutely.
And those shifts, they escalated fast. The book details October 7th, 1950. That's when around 40,000 PLA soldiers crossed the Druchu River into calm eastern Tibet.
40,000. That's a major force.
And it was quick. By October 19th, Chamdo had fallen. The governor, Ngabo Ngawang Chigme, was captured.
Right, and that really marked the start of the invasion proper, swift, decisive military action.
If you look at the bigger picture, this is happening just after the PRC is established, right?
Exactly. And Asia is still reshaping itself after World War II.
India protested, didn't they? Newly independent India.
They did. Lodged a protest, expressed concern for regional peace. But, being a new nation itself, with its own border issues, stronger action was limited. It shows that classic tension, idealism versus pragmatism in international politics.
What's also quite compelling is his personal memory. Even as a teenager, he sensed trouble was brewing. He mentions this specific moment, seeing disbelief on Regent Tadrak Rinpoche's face when reading a telegram about a Chinese raid on a Tibetan outpost. That early intuition.
It shows the leadership was aware, wasn't it? Aware of the growing threat.
But, and this is crucial, the book makes it clear Tibet was largely alone.
Yeah, internationally isolated at that critical time.
Only El Salvador even tried to get it on the UN agenda.
And none of the big powers backed them.
Especially Great Britain, given the history, the Lhasa and Simla conventions, that lack of support was, deeply felt.
It's that stark reality, isn't it? Realpolitik often just overrides historical ties or moral arguments.
So moving into those early years after the invasion, he talks about meeting Chairman Mao in Beijing. This was 54 to 55.
Right, and these early interactions are complex, some surprising nuances in China's initial approach, maybe.
Well, yeah. Mao apparently gave permission for Tibet to keep its national flag.
Really? That's fascinating.
Which suggests maybe Mao initially thought of a model like the Soviet republics, where national symbols could continue.
Possibly. He notes Mao even told Chinese officials in Tibet to display the Tibetan flag next to China's and his picture beside Mao's.
Which is such a stark contrast to today, where the flag is illegal, possessing it can mean prison.
Absolutely. It shows how that initial, perhaps, tolerance hardened into a much more rigid stance on Tibetan identity over time.
You have to wonder, what was Mao's thinking then? Was it just strategic?
Could be. Maybe projecting unity initially, consolidating control gradually, believing symbols could coexist with socialism. But clearly, the ideology hardened later, emphasizing central control, suppressing distinct identities.
That early hope, whatever it was, really started to unravel between 56 and 59. That's the lead up to exile. November 56, he travels to India with the Panchen Lama. And right at the border, his brothers meet him.
And they have an urgent message.
Yeah. You must not go back. That moment, the urgency, it signals things were getting really bad inside Tibet.
And during that India visit, he meets key leaders, Nehru, Radhakrishnan, President Prasad.
And he visits Rajghat, Gandhi's cremation site. That was deeply significant for him, wasn't it?
Hugely. It solidified that commitment to nonviolence that became, the defining principle of his leadership. and the whole Tibetan struggle.
He also made pilgrimages to Buddhist sites across India, deepening his spiritual side.
Right.
But those talks with Nehru are revealing. He tells Nehru about the situation in the East, the bombing of Lithang Monastery, his fears about cultural destruction. He actually wanted to stay in India then.
To work for Tibet's freedom peacefully from exile.
But Nehru, while agreeing armed resistance was futile, felt India couldn't officially back independence.
Right. Nehru advised him to go back, try to work within the 17-point agreement. He even went through it with the Dalai Lama, pointing at parts he thought guaranteed real autonomy.
Nehru seemed genuinely convinced based on talks with Zhu Enlai.
He did. He emphasized the assurances he'd received about self-rule.
But the Dalai Lama was skeptical, deeply skeptical. He'd already seen the agreement wasn't working out that way.
He'd lived it.
So he makes the tough decision to return. There's this sad farewell to his brother, Lobsang Samten. It's a real clash, isn't it? Nehru's diplomatic hope versus the Dalai Lama's lived experience of broken promises.
Yeah. And meanwhile, resistance inside Tibet is growing. But the Dalai Lama remains committed to nonviolence.
Even when the Americans hinted at potential support for the resistance.
Even then, his admiration for Gandhi was profound. He believed force against the much stronger Chinese army would be catastrophic, suicidal even.
Which brings us to 1959, a watershed year. Tensions boil over in Lhasa, leading to the uprising on March 10th.
And the PLA responds with heavy bombardment, a moment of extreme danger for everyone, especially him.
He recalls March 17th, mortar shells landing near the Norbilinka Palace, a clear warning.
And earlier that day, the state oracle, Nesheng, in a trance, had urged him to leave immediately.
Right. That, plus his own insights, made the need to flee undeniable.
It wasn't just personal safety, was it? It was about protecting others, too.
Exactly. Everyone around him was pleading with him to escape. So he makes this agonizing choice. He describes visiting the Mahakala Chapel, changing into layman's clothes.
And then slipping out of the Norbilinka, disguised, under cover of darkness.
Leaving his people, his home. The emotional weight must have been immense.
Unimaginable. He even mentioned seeing the Potala Palace one last time as they crossed a pass. A final farewell. Such a profound personal sacrifice.
After this dangerous journey, they finally reached India on March 31st, 1959.
He's 25 years old, a refugee.
But he also felt, as he says, this deep sense of relief, safety at last, and immediately his focus shifts.
To the refugees, tens of thousands following him into exile. Their immediate needs became the priority.
And looking back later, he gained this broader view, didn't he, on the timing of it all.
Yeah, how the major powers were preoccupied post-WWII with decolonization, just as China asserted control over Tibet. Kind of the worst possible timing for Tibet internationally.
It left them incredibly vulnerable, and he points out this powerful irony.
While old empires were dissolving, China was effectively creating its own by taking over Tibet.
Yeah. And he argues that forcing this union hasn't just harmed Tibetans, it's created instability for China, too. Those persistent ethnic tensions.
Because you can't just impose one national identity onto distinct peoples who don't want it. It's inherently unstable.
So those initial years in exile must have been incredibly challenging, just practically speaking.
Immense challenges. He mentions the passionate debates in India's parliament about Tibet. Figures like Jai Prakash Narayan really spoke out strongly on moral grounds.
Then, June 20th, 1959, his first formal press conference, he lays it out clearly.
Declares Tibet's historical independence, calls the invasion aggression, and says the 17-point agreement is invalid because China broke its terms.
Setting the stage for decades of international advocacy.
Right. And appeals to the UN followed, leading to resolutions about human rights concerns. The Central Tibetan Administration, the government in exile, was established.
And crucially, education. With Nehru's support, focusing on educating refugee kids.
Yes, preserving Tibetan culture but also providing modern education. The central schools for Tibetans, vital for long-term survival.
Meanwhile, back inside Tibet, the reports were grim. Severe hardship, repression.
He mentions the Panchen Lama's 70,000-character petition from 1962. Which even Mao apparently called an attack on the party.
And what did it detail?
Widespread suffering, famine, systematic destruction of religion, monasteries, culture. It really shows the scale of the devastation after the uprising.
Decades pass. Then, 1978, Deng Xiaoping comes to power in China. And the Dalai Lama shifts strategy, starts overtures towards dialogue.
Yeah, his March 10th statement that year was quite pragmatic. He basically said, look, if Tibetans inside Tibet are genuinely happy and prosperous, we have no argument. Let's have open visits to see.
That's a significant shift, isn't it? Moving away from demanding immediate independence.
It is. He realized that pushing for full independence likely meant a long, bloody, and probably unwinnable armed struggle
So the focus changed.
to safeguarding the core things: language,
Yeah.
culture, religion, and acknowledging that dialogue with China was essential.
Which led to the middle way approach.
Exactly, seeking genuine autonomy within the PRC, not separation. And when talks stalled, taking the case to the international community, the fourth refuge, he called it.
That's when proposals like the 5-point peace plan in '87 and the Strasbourg proposal in '88 emerged.
Right. Key ideas there were Tibet as a self-governing democracy associated with China. China handles foreign policy, keeps a limited military presence.
And the Tibetan community endorsed the Strasbourg proposal unanimously.
They did. But China rejected it initially, even though the Dalai Lama explicitly said they weren't seeking independence anymore. Shows the depth of the mistrust, the gap in understanding.
And even while that dialogue was stalled, he was speaking out about other things, like Tiananmen Square in '89.
Yes, strong condemnation of the crackdown. He saw it as a rekindling of the desire for freedom among Chinese people. He even met with Chinese democracy leaders and exiled intellectuals, offering support.
Showing a commitment to democratic values beyond just Tibet.
Definitely.
But back on the Tibet front, things got tougher under Jiang Zemin in the '90s, didn't they?
Yes, the stance hardened, repression increased, and more incentives for Chinese migration into Tibet, which caused a lot of resentment.
And dialogue attempts were still being rejected.
Pretty much. By '91, the Dalai Lama said he wasn't strictly bound by the earlier peace plans anymore, but he still wanted negotiation.
But China kept insisting on this precondition, right? Publicly renounce independence.
Which he'd essentially already done with the Middle Way. It seemed like a deliberate obstacle. He even wrote directly to Ding and Jiang in '92, reiterating openness to talks.
And China's response?
That same year, they published their white paper, Tibet, its ownership and human rights situation, basically doubling down on their historical claim, a fundamental disagreement.
Through all these decades of difficulty, where did he find strength, inspiration?
He talks about historical parallels, like ancient Chinese Buddhist pilgrims traveling to India. He emphasizes taking a wider, longer view to understand the complexities.
And he reflects on exile itself. A tragedy, obviously, but also
Unexpected opportunities for growth, engaging with different fields like science. It's quite a perspective. And always stressing hope, courage, faith in humanity.
There's a particularly difficult part of the story involving the Panchen Lama's reincarnation.
Yes, very sensitive. He recounts the confidential search process, the traditional divinations, leading to his recognition of Gendon Chokinyama in 1995.
But China objected strongly.
They insisted on using their system, the Golden Urn. And then the boy, Gendon Chokinyama, disappeared. He's never been seen publicly since.
And China installed their own choice as Panchen Lama, a major interference in Tibetan religious practice.
Absolutely. A huge point of ongoing contention.
Yet he kept trying for dialogue. Appeals to Jiang Zemin, condolences when Deng's died, expressing regret about the lack of progress.
Talks did resume, actually, in 2002. 9 rounds between then and 2010.
But not much came of them.
Limited substantive progress, seems like. Often overshadowed by other things, like the run-up to the 2008 Beijing Olympics.
And 2008 also saw those major protests across Tibet.
Right, and the Dalai Lama appealed for nonviolence from Tibetans, and interestingly also voiced support for the Beijing Olympics themselves.
Then came a massive change in 2011.
His full retirement from political duties, devolving that authority to the elected leadership of the Central Tibetan Administration.
The end of the Dalai Lama's role as temporal leaders, though he remains committed to the cause, obviously.
Deeply committed, just not in that formal political role.
The book also has to address the self-immolations inside Tibet.
Yeah, starting around 2009. Deeply distressing.
How does he talk about it?
With profound sadness and pain. He acknowledges the utter desperation driving these acts, the hopelessness under Chinese rule. But he also makes clear he doesn't encourage them. It's a reflection of that extreme despair.
So, looking back at why the dialogue stalled for so long,
Yeah.
he compares it to Hong Kong, doesn't he?
Yeah, asks why a deal was possible there, but not for Tibet.
Yeah.
He points to that fundamental disconnect. He says, quite starkly, no Tibetan will ever say, I am a Chinese.
That sums it up, really. It's about identity, culture, well-being, not just his personal status.
Exactly. And he feels there just hasn't been the political will from the Chinese side to find a genuine solution that respects Tibetan identity.
But despite all the setbacks, he still holds on to hope.
He does. He points to signs like growing understanding and sympathy among ordinary Chinese people.
He's had dialogues with Chinese scholars.
Yes, and held teachings for Chinese Buddhists in India. He even mentions individual Chinese people apologizing for the suffering in Tibet.
And he emphasizes the resilience inside Tibet. After decades, the spirit hasn't been broken.
Right. The moral rightness of their cause, the power of truth, that's their leverage, he believes.
What about his own future, his reincarnation? That's a huge question.
He's very clear. It must follow traditional Tibetan Buddhist methods. Any selection by the Chinese government, politically motivated, should not be accepted or recognized.
And he suggests the next Dalai Lama might be born outside Tibet.
He says it's likely the next one will be born in the free world to continue the mission. That has huge implications, obviously.
So as he concludes, what's his final message?
An appeal to Tibetans. Never lose hope, remember your history of resilience, and deep, heartfelt gratitude to India for the refuge and support.
And his core message for everyone.
Compassion. The oneness of humanity. That's the path to peace and happiness. He believes Tibetan knowledge, that culture of compassion, has something valuable to offer the whole world.
Okay, so to wrap up our deep dive today, we've traced the Dalai Lama's own story, the invasion, the incredibly challenging path of exile, that unwavering commitment to nonviolence and seeking genuine autonomy for his people.
We've seen the tough realities of geopolitics, haven't we? But also the amazing resilience of a culture and, importantly, the power of hope against huge odds.
Right. And thinking about his constant call for a wider perspective, here's something for you, the listener, to consider.
How might current conflicts around the world look different if we really viewed them through that lens he talks about interconnectedness, our shared desire for happiness and freedom?
What assumptions might start to shift in your own thinking?
And what new possibilities, maybe unexpected ones, for understanding, even resolution, might open up not just for Tibet and China, but elsewhere, if we truly embrace that broader, more compassionate view of our shared humanity?